We have now our second session of the day, which is what kind of research is needed in the field of social determinants of health. And I hope that this morning has already got you thinking about why this topic is so important. We kind of have talked about the importance of health equity in this whole concept, but what we're now focusing on is methodologies and what kind of research this is going to entail. Now, to moderate this session, we have Carlos Muntaner, who you've already met, and I will let him introduce the rest of his panel. So yeah, Carlos, it's up to you.
It's a great pleasure for me to introduce the distinguished members of this panel, which I believe are some of the most interesting researchers today in the fields of sociology of health and social epidemiology, and that they embrace the social determinants of health, social inequalities in health, transdisciplinary field as well. First, we'll have Megan Reynolds from the University of Utah, where she's an associate professor of sociology, whose interest is into the relationship between illness, health, policy, and sociology, and who's developed, in my opinion, a brilliant model of power resources theory, which is relational. And I hope that she talks more about it, because I think it's very relevant to social determinants of health. Next, here is where, unfortunately, we cannot have the presence of Dr. Ham Zadou from Turkey. I hope he's not detained by Erdogan, like he was a few years ago, who was known for his studies of pollution in Turkey, and then for his activism in human rights that got him in prison. Again, I don't know, I hope it's not the same what happened to him today. Next, well, I'll have a brief intervention instead of him. We'll have Seth Prins, who's an assistant going to associate professor of epidemiology and sociomedical sciences at the Mailman School of Public Health, University of Columbia. His extremely original research and creative endeavors are channeled through two research programs. One is on the public health effects of the massive incarceration, disproportionately Black and brown in the US. And then the study of the social division of labor and its effects on mental health, including a relational approach to social class as a dynamic political economic process. I'm very happy that he's here with us today. He's also a colleague. And the third intervention, also from a colleague, is by Jerzy Eisenberg-Guyot, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the training program in psychiatric epidemiology at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University also. I would say he would be assistant or associate everywhere else. He has devoted years of research into political economy of health, or political epidemiology, if you want. And he had very interesting findings on how the declining density of unionization and declining union militancy affected the class gender, and racialized inequalities in health in the US. And he also studies class as a relational process in a way, well, you will see probably he will talk about that. Sometimes he seems influenced by some Catalan epidemiologists that nobody knows. But that you will see that's really an impressive body of research that he's developed. Is very high quality as well. So without further ado, I'm really honored to have these three presenters with me today. So Megan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carlos. Everybody can hear me okay? In the back? Yeah, okay, great. I just want to say thank you to my hosts who have been so generous in inviting me in making my visit as painless as possible, and in providing this amazing opportunity to spend some time with what I would call sort of scholarly academic kindred spirits. So as Carlos mentioned, the reason that I'm here, you know who I am, and he told you a little bit about why I am here. I'm gonna expand on that by saying that my work over the last 10 years or so has gradually evolved from a research platform focused primarily on what I would call social policy as health policy, to one in which I'm beginning to understand the roots of social policy or lack thereof through the lens of power and power dynamics. And so I think the reason that I was selected for today's panel was in part because I am trying to formalize theoretically a little bit a framework for understanding how power operates to affect health inequalities. I'm going to walk you through my understanding of that over the next 20 or so minutes. And I think I have a little longer since one of our panelists will not be here. But hopefully I'll be able to keep your attention during that time. So let's start back in the 1980s. Some of you in this room might not have been born then. And epidemiological approaches to understanding health back then really emphasized the role of behavioral risk factors, largely obscuring any structural explanations for well-being. The 1995 publication of Social Conditions as Fundamental Causes of Disease by Bruce Link and Joe Phelan. And for any of you who don't know, Joe is actually a woman. She is Bruce's wife. And she is, according to Bruce, the mastermind behind fundamental causes. So just to give credit where credit is due. So in this 1995 publication in the Journal of Health and Social Behavior, Link and Phelan offered this really compelling alternative to risk factor epidemiology at the time, borrowing from the work of Jim House and some other folks. They essentially forwarded this theory of fundamental causation, which posited that social conditions, and they were really defining social conditions as characteristics of the individual, that social conditions like socioeconomic status and race and gender were inextricably linked to the wide and dynamic array of outcomes and mechanisms related to health, and that they were related essentially through the differential distribution of what they refer to as flexible resources. So fundamental causes provided an account not only of why health inequalities existed, but also why they are so reliably reproduced over time, despite the fact that we see very dramatic changes in healthcare access, in lifestyle choices and information, and neighborhood quality, et cetera, et cetera. Based on the attention that they paid to socioeconomic status as a flexible resource, sociologists, who are the primary audience of the Journal of Health and Social Behavior, really latched on to this idea and generated a volume of research linking income and education, which is primarily how we operationalize socioeconomic status, to health using this fundamental cause framework. So the elegance of this fundamental cause concept and the rapid pace with which it was adopted, unfortunately obscured some other really interesting aspects of the theory. Before even introducing the notion of social conditions as fundamental causes, Lincoln Phelan devoted the opening section of that now seminal article to an argument about the need to contextualize risk factors. They said, in quotes, efforts to reduce risk by changing behavior may be hopelessly ineffective if there is no clear understanding of the process that leads to exposure. For example, there are powerful, emphasis added, social, cultural, and economic factors leading to the diet of poor people in the United States. Consequently, providing information about healthy diet to poor people and exhorting them to follow nutritional guidelines, and you can hear now sort of echoes of Marmot, right, is unlikely to have much impact. Without an understanding of the context that leads to risk, the responsibility for reducing risk is left with the individual. Nothing is done to alter the more fundamental factors that put people at risk of risks. So for Lincoln Phelan then, the social, cultural, and economic factors determined the extent to which the social conditions were linked to the exposures that led to disease. Lincoln Phelan set forth contextualizing risk factors as the catalysts that transform social conditions into fundamental causes. But despite the primacy of this concept of contextualizing risk factors, the scholarship never really capitalized on this idea. It just didn't get off the ground. So while medical sociologists were pursuing this, proliferation of research on fundamental causation, scholars in other countries, primarily European countries, were beginning to take a more comparative political approach to understanding what it is that generates health inequalities in different nations. And they sort of landed on, although it probably was not articulated for some time, this idea that it is really institutions that function to contextualize risk factors for health. The literature that came to be known, I think, most commonly as the political economy of health, dived or delved very deeply into how these institutions influenced health through processes of stratification. And one especially comprehensive account of this in regard to the welfare state as an institution of stratification is provided by Jason Beckfield and Claire Bambra, and was published in, I think, the journal Sociology of Health and Illness in 2015. And so this is a very sophisticated framework to describe how the welfare state functions as an institution of stratification to produce and reproduce health inequalities. So underlying the emphasis on institutions and stratification that came out of this political economy of health literature was the assumption that power relations actually matter for life chances. And the assumption is strongly supported by a theory in political science that was imported by many sociologists known as power resources. And the theory basically asserts at least that in rich democracies, the more power the working class can consolidate in labor unions and in left-leaning parties, and people have looked at other sort of manifestations of power, the greater the downward distribution of resources that improve health. So power resources theory is really focused on economic outcomes or economic well-being, as some people might term it, and has rarely been leveraged to understand differences in health outcomes, which is pretty curious considering that power distributions constitute, I think, many of us would agree, preeminent contexts that put people at risks. So I would argue that there are four main processes that link power relations to health. And the first of these is stratification. We're all pretty familiar with this, which is the idea that the initial distribution of resources is conditioned on one's position in the social hierarchy. The remaining three mechanisms that link power relations to health are probably less recognized, but I would argue are actually just as potent as stratification. And I describe these mechanisms as commodification, discrimination, and devitalization. And I'm going to talk a little bit about socioeconomic resources, which is a very familiar term to you all, but also health relevant resources. And so I just want to define for you that term right now. So when I say health relevant resources, I'm talking about resources that directly affect health. So nutrition, healthcare, health education, stress, lifestyle, safety. And the argument that I'm making here is that power relations actually affect how socioeconomic resources are translated into health relevant resources through a variety of processes. So let me talk a little bit about these mechanisms, these mechanisms of translation. And again, we're talking here about commodification, discrimination, and devitalization. So commodification is typically defined as the provision of basic needs based on labor market participation rather than on social citizenship. And health commodification or decommodification, as it's been presented by Claire Bambra, represents the extent to which an individual's access to health care is dependent on their market position. A prime example of health decommodification, which we've already talked about some here, is universal healthcare, right? Which sort of decouples healthcare to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the system, from income and from labor market participation. The extensive commodification movement in the United States, so people might also describe this as privatization or marketization, commercialization, themes that have already come up today. The extensive commodification in the United States, for example, helps to explain why many innovations in medical technology, we are after all heralded as one of the foremost producers of healthcare technology, why those medical innovations come to be associated with the emergence or the maintenance of health disparities. So we may have excellent tools at our disposal, but very few people have access to them. In establishing the basis for receiving social goods and services, power holders shape the intensity of commodification. Receipt of goods and services may be based on ability to pay. So here I'm taking the US as an example. For example, daycare in the US is entirely based on ability to pay. Based on need, so programs that target income deprivation, so subsidized housing, or based on neither, such as Medicare, not Medicaid, right? Medicare, my old advisor used to say, I remember the difference because we care about the elderly, but we just give aid to the poor. So a wealth of research suggests that the effects of socioeconomic status and other associated statuses vary substantially between nations depending on the degree and the nature of decommodification. A second mechanism through which power relations translate the meaning of socioeconomic resources is discrimination, which alters the value of socioeconomic resources. Specifically, thinking about factors such as racism, sexism, homophobia, and other forms of systematic biases subject minoritized groups to disproportionate amounts of psychosocial or physical insults than you would predict based on their SES alone. So this is why you find that looking at high income Blacks in America, for example, and high income whites, you still find a marked gap in health outcomes. So essentially there's a sort of diminished return to the advantages of that socioeconomic resources normally impart. So power relations shape the intensity of discrimination by establishing rules that define which social goods are considered rights and which individuals deserve such rights, and then by enforcing those rules. The final mechanism through which power relations, I would argue, translate the meaning of socioeconomic resources is something that I call devitalization. And it's a term that I came up with. It is not common in the parlance, so I'm going to go into slightly more depth about it. In the context of this theory, devitalization refers to the act of depriving an individual of vitality, vigor, or effectiveness relative to social psychological factors to deter the application of health enhancing resources. So here, this is really less about the resources you have and more about how you use them or don't. Devitalization is but one example of how social conditions influence people's response to their environment. Social psychologists have found that under conditions of deprivation, the burden of managing stressors impairs people's ability to think about and their willingness to plan for the future. This results in a predisposition towards shorter time horizons, and shorter time horizons are then associated with a preference for health behaviors and choices that are conducive more to immediate satisfaction than to later life health. So devitalization is a little different than these other mechanisms in that commodification and discrimination really describe processes through which power influences the options that are available to people. And devitalization focuses instead on the process through which power influences which options people actually exercise. So this is the agency within structure situation. Devitalization still accounts for the constraints that are imposed by disempowerment, but it focuses on how choices are made within those constraints. So based on all of this that we know about how power shapes the distribution of resources and how it translates those resources into things that matter for health, it would seem that power relations stand out as a potentially valuable concept in improving the understanding of population health and specifically health inequalities. And to that end, I have devised this theory of health power resources. So this is obviously inspired by the work on fundamental causes and the contextualization of risk factors in particular. And it is inspired by political economy of health, and it is inspired by power resources proper in the political science field, but it constitutes more than simply an extension of these things. Beyond the fact that the theory is centered on a different outcome, health, the classic version of power resources is concerned almost exclusively with a single societal institution, which is the welfare state. So how do labor unions and how do left-leaning parties grow the welfare state to better serve the working class in a nation? HPR, I'm gonna call it for short, really moves beyond expanding beyond the focus on the welfare state and also beyond expanding the conceptualization of independent and dependent variables. The hallmark of the theory is less in its applicability than its ability to, within a single framework, account for the complex ways in which power translates the meaning of socioeconomic and health relevant resources by determining how necessary they are, how valuable they are, and how likely they are to be used in the service of health. With rare exception, the terminus for original power resources theory is the distribution of socioeconomic resources. It really has little to say about the meaning of those resources. And health power resources, on the other hand, regards the translation of socioeconomic resources via these processes that I described, commodification and discrimination and devitalization, as the crucial stage at which health inequalities emerge. So it's not just what people, politics sort of classically define, kind of who gets what when, right? It's not just that, it's what people are able to do with the things that they are given or not given. HPR offers a unified way to understand how the power that inheres in welfare states, but also in many other social structures, affects health by determining, yes, what people get, but also what they can do with those things. So there's a few things that I would argue that the theory allows us to do that previous frameworks have been somewhat ill-equipped for. So one thing is that the theory allows us to understand empirical findings that can't really be explained neatly by the prevailing explanations. So first, it solves that tricky problem of how a fixed characteristic can be a cause of anything, right? So individual level characteristics are, as many of us in this room appreciate, really just proxies for complex dynamics. So when we say that, race or sex is a cause of poorer health, what we really mean is that racism and sexism is a cause of poorer health. So this is especially true of characteristics like those that are relatively unchanging across a person's lifetime. Now, humanists in the room will take issue with me alleging that race or sex are unchanging, but generally speaking, people ascribe to one, for the entirety of their life. So by concentrating on the distribution of power between groups, it really reorients away from the focus of these individual characteristics and to the underlying dynamics that make those characteristics matter. Second, I would argue that the theory accounts for resource gradients that are not accompanied by the expected health gradients. So research on the occupational gradient and health indicates that despite their higher wages, supervisors often exhibit higher rates of depression and anxiety than the frontline workers that they manage. So how do we make sense of that if we're talking just about socioeconomic status as a fundamental cause? Well, findings like this can actually be accommodated by this theory because it acknowledges that unlike the wage distribution, the power distribution for supervisors is not linear. So as a result of collective bargaining, supervisors may actually possess less power than the workers that they're overseeing. And so we can understand some things that don't really line up using a fundamental cause or a more kind of conventional social determinants of health framework. Third, health power resources unearths the processes that influence institutional effects on health. Although it advances the understanding of how institutions function to affect health, political economy of health literature remains mostly silent as to why different institutions function the way that they do. HBR suggests that the functional characteristics of an institution are actually a reflection of how power resources were catalyzed at its onset and how they continue to operate in the present day. And finally, viewing lifestyle choices as a response to HPR's theorized mechanism of devitalization resolves some of the long-standing questions around why individuals might adopt unhealthy behaviors, even when healthier options have been made easily available, right? So even when there are not economic barriers to making these choices, even if a nutritious diet is not 80% of your income, you may still elect something else. Why? Devitalization gives us at least a little bit of a starting place to understand that. So, in summary, HBR really privileges the context, going back to those contextualized risk factors, the contexts that put people at risk of risks, right? As Joanne had said earlier, the causes of the causes of the causes. And it's really kind of agnostic about whether those things are behaviors or characteristics or constraints. It suggests a specific type of context, which is the distribution of power, as a candidate explanation for how inequalities across groups emerge. By emphasizing how stratification and commodification, discrimination, and devitalization collectively influence the distribution and the meaning of resources, the theory illuminates how power relations between social groups are likely to predict differences in population health. Now, I get a little bit choked up here because Nancy Krieger, who in this room has read Nancy Krieger? Yeah. If you haven't read Nancy Krieger, read Nancy Krieger. Yeah. I think, I don't remember she's a little, how would you describe the text? A little bit esoteric, little impenetrable. Yes, referential would also be true, but she's very into clever names of articles. And I think the one that I'm going to mention here that I think is just so powerful, and that I really hope to engage with my theory now that I'm tenured, is called something about the spider.
Yes, that was one of the first.
Right, the web of causation. Who's seen the spider or something, right? So, you know, the idea, the thrust of that article is that we talk a lot about the outcomes of power imbalances, and we talk a lot about what gets done to people, but we do not talk about the doers. And so this theory of power resources also allows us to talk a little bit about the doers, and as Joanne had said, you know, the who, right? The who is doing these things that we know damage health, right? So as in Krieger's web of causation, the theory draws scrutiny to the spider that is outside the current theoretical and empirical ambit. The insights generated by fundamental cause and political economy of health literatures effectively shifted attention towards social and political conditions that drive very important intermediary factors. I would argue that we should take the opportunity that this theory and other theories of power dynamics and health, and mine is not the only, that we should take the opportunity that these theories provide to recast social and political drivers as intermediary factors and focus on power and other relational constructs that continue to expand our view of how society influences health. An added advantage is that studying modifiable relational factors that enable health inequalities persist will also likely improve the translation of our research into tangible public action and help us to actually ameliorate some of the health inequalities that we seek to understand. And thank you all.
Well,
Hi, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to give my thoughts on this topic and to those who are listening in. My name is Jersey Eisenbergio, and I'm a postdoc at Columbia. And in my presentation, which is called Following the Class Power, I'll provide some background on class analysis and epidemiology and argue for more research on the role of class power in population patterns of health and health inequities, focusing on the US context, given my background and expertise. So in epidemiology, two main approaches are used to investigate the social causes of health inequities: relational and stratificationist. Researchers using relational approaches analyze health inequities in terms of social relations, such as conflicts between groups struggling for power and control over resources. They theorize that inequities arise because the welfare and security of particular groups causally depends on the deprivation of others. In contrast, researchers using stratificationist approaches which dominate health disparities research, analyze the social causes of health inequities in terms of differences in inherited or achieved attributes of individuals, like their incomes and educations, rather than in terms of social relations. Stratificationist measures have proven to be powerful predictors of morbidity and mortality. However, by reducing the causes of health inequities to differences in individual level attributes, stratificationist approaches ignore social relations that affect health through pathways other than socioeconomic status, like relations causing stress, and they elide the structural factors that produce socioeconomic status and cause inequitable distributions of health-promoting resources like income. Thus, stratificationist approaches are less powerful than relational ones in identifying the root causes of health inequities. Among the most common relational theories in social determinants of health research is Eric Olin Wright's neo-Marxist theory, which Wright and others developed to analyze complex and heterogeneous class dynamics in modern capitalist societies, and which researchers like Dr. Muntaner brought to epidemiologic research in the early 1990s. The theory measures class along two primary dimensions: power over labor and productive property in the workplace. The fundamental distinction is between capitalists, those who own productive property and hire labor, and workers, those who own no property and must sell their labor to capitalists for a wage. Under the theory, mechanisms of exploitation and domination link capitalists and workers. Indeed, through exploitation, capitalists appropriate the fruits of workers' labor, and through domination, capitalists exert control over workers' labor activities. In modern societies, however, substantial segments of the workforce occupy contradictory locations between workers and capitalists. For example, most managers lack productive property and must sell their labor to capitalists. Managers control workers' labor and often develop company policy, exercising delegated ownership authority and facing minimal workplace domination. Meanwhile, the petite bourgeoisie, like shopkeepers, own productive property, but they do not control workers' labor and instead must labor themselves. The relationship between capitalists, who constitute a minority of the population, and workers, who constitute a large majority, causes health inequities because the wealth of capitalists relates inversely to labor costs and positively to labor effort. That is, the material welfare of capitalists depends upon the deprivation and overexertion of workers. For example, insofar as businesses can and often must to survive, increase profits by intensifying working hours and eroding wages and safety, the profits of capitalists comes at the expense of workers' health, who may face overwork, insecurity, job loss, and occupational hazards, especially women and racially minoritized people who are segregated into the working class and funneled into especially disempowered employment within workplaces. Managers in the petite bourgeoisie often face unique risks in the workplace. For example, although they may operate relatively autonomously, the petite bourgeoisie often lacks sufficient resources to compete with capitalists, causing precarity and stress. Likewise, low-level managers may face exploitation and domination from upper management and hostility from workers below them, inducing stress and other risks. Indeed, prior research has identified large inequities in adverse working conditions and health across classes, with workers and sometimes the petite bourgeoisie faring worse than others, including in factors like income, repetitive labor tasks, decision-making authority on the job, and being treated with respect at work. So relational theory suggests that the magnitude of class inequities in a given workplace or historical period is shaped by the balance of power between workers and capitalists. And recent trends, including plummeting labor union density, skyrocketing income inequities across classes, and growing income inequities in life expectancy, suggest capitalist class power is consolidating, which may exacerbate class mortality inequities. Nonetheless, few studies using relational theories have analyzed changes in class mortality inequities over time, a substantial gap given burgeoning mortality disparities across other social axes. Thus, one question that needs answering is how have class mortality inequities changed over the last few decades in the United States? A recent study Dr. Prins and I conducted using National Health Interview Survey data suggests that class mortality inequities between workers and incorporated business owners tripled from 1986 to 2019. But we need more studies and better data, including finer measures of supervisory authority and business structure, which would allow researchers to capture the complexity of class structure in modern capitalist societies. Leveraging underused administrative data could help address these measurement issues and facilitate more rigorous class analysis, including by incorporating class dynamics at the very top of the class structure, where employer power has consolidated most sharply. Currently available, if restricted, linkages that might help on this front include those between the Health and Retirement Study and the Census Business Register, as well as between Social Security Administration mortality data and IRS tax records, both of which contain detailed information on employer size, revenue, and organizational structure. Another question that needs answering is, what is the role of changing class power dynamics in burgeoning mortality inequities and sinking US population health, which could be directly tested by linking social class and mortality data to data on trends in macroeconomic measures of class power, like labor shares of income and labor movement strength and activity, as well as data on trends in workplace level measures of class power, including the prevalence of union membership and workplace level psychosocial and material hazards. And a final urgent question is, what interventions could mitigate or eliminate class inequities? To this end, researchers can investigate the effects on class inequities of policies that build power among workers and other oppressed groups, including those that strengthen labor protections and decommodify necessities. Research could also investigate the effects on class inequities of social movement organizing, including the effects of recent strike waves or gig and service worker unionization campaigns at monopolies like Amazon and Starbucks. And finally, researchers can investigate the effects on class inequities of more fundamental economic restructuring, including by collecting and analyzing data on the effects of socialistic workplace structures like worker-owned cooperatives, for example, or by using epidemiologic methods to simulate counterfactual, revolutionary worlds in which income, wealth, and power disparities across classes are eliminated. In an era of declining population health, growing inequities, and a pandemic causing historic occupational death tolls, a return to research on class and class power is more vital than ever. Thanks again to the organizers for inviting me to give this recording, and to my collaborators at Columbia and the University of Washington. My email address is je2433@cumc.columbia.edu if you have any questions. Thanks again.
It's very difficult to go after Jersey, as I agree with every word he said. And but what I'm going to do, since there was this space that we didn't have filled, is go over a critique of the standard model that is mostly used in social determinants of health, which is the Commission in 2008. And here you have the standard model represented, and the questions that it brought to me since the beginning, and I had the opportunity to briefly mention that to Sir Marmot, is that when the socioeconomic and political context is brought just as a context, it puts the brunt of the explanation on the socioeconomic position and the other attributes of individuals, such as here social class, understood as an individual characteristic, gender, ethnicity, and education and occupation and income. All of these are considered individual attributes, as if you were in a world with people don't interact and they work independently in a piece of land, and at the end of the day, one puts more effort than the other, and thus gets more rewarded. I don't see the world like that, and as you can see, Jersey, neither. And first, I thought, well, this is relational, it's not individual. And the so-called political context is also social. Who puts the governance, macro economic policies, social policies, and public policies in action? Who's responsible? Who benefits? Nothing of that is there. And then there is the mechanism that translates into individual health. The one that's the most important is social capital, difficult construct to understand. Social cohesion is more traditional sociology, but definitely you can imagine that there might be others. Not everything is about getting along in the labor market. So also, when we talk about structural determinants of the social determinants of health inequities, what do we mean by that? What are the structural determinants? So alternatively, I propose an answer to these questions. So in a modern capitalist society or wealthy, those that are in charge of governance, macro-socioeconomic policies or policies are capitalists and managers. Think about financial capitalism influence, and politicians who often work for them directly or indirectly. There is certain variation, but at the end of the day, we found that they have the most influence. And I would put also for the cultural aspect, the owners of the big media, who obviously, and in Spain more than in other places, I can remember, that has been revealed in a very crude fashion with all kinds of recordings. Think about Villarejo and Ferreras, right? So here we have capitalist managers and politicians are responsible for implementing all these policies and ruling these power structures that were considered context in the previous slide. Then we had structural factors. I would say a structure is the sum of relations. That's what it means. So why use a structural when you can talk about political and economic and cultural, including ideological and scientific determinants of health? That to me would be clearer, because otherwise we would be led to things like the structure of a structure, which doesn't make sense. So I think that the common parlance of structural determinants would be clear if it was substituted by what kind of structure are we talking? And in human societies and in the tradition of the Weberian sociology, that he was very clear, in my view, more than Marx, you can break down into political, economic, and cultural subsystems. So that's another modification. And when we come to the individual level, there are forms of oppression and exploitation that are mechanisms that can affect health, not just individual factors. So oppression and exploitation are social relations, and these can be included in such social relations like class, but also racial relations, gender, trans relationships, colonization, aging relations, and new feudal relations. As you can see in the more modern gig platform labor market, which sometimes deviates clearly from a capitalist mode of production and resembles more a feudal form of production. So these are the forms of that generate inequality and inequality in health. And we should be aware that when you have Black health, we have white supremacy. When we have cisgender, we have trans poor health. When we have heterosexism, we have LGBTQ as poor health, and so on, for every form of social relation that produces inequality. And that in a metaphorical way, but it can be studied with more precision, as Dr. Marmot suggested, gets under your skin. That's a metaphor. And the proximal level is socio-psychobiological. It takes away the mystery of the other label. And who are the affected? Well, are the BIPOC, the non-binary, women, workers, non-serf, aged, colonized, migrants, disabled, and ethnic groups, for example. As I believe that class has a fundamental effect in most inequalities, and that's my bias, I privilege class as a mechanism. But that doesn't mean that I ignore any of the other mechanisms that generate inequality. And class generates precariousness. And you can see here how you have almost 4 billion people in the world that are precarious workers. From the Global Reserve Army of Labor, I would say unemployed, and informal, to the 1.6 billions of workers, mostly in precarious employment conditions, unstable, without benefits. So that's why I privilege class. But we need to understand how these mechanisms operate. Here is an example of patriarchal capitalism and gender-based violence. We may start with male domination, sexism, and misogyny. It's an ideology, and is also a power relation, which led to beliefs and stereotypes about gender that justify attitudes in everyday life, ending into the extraction of labor of women. And that's what we call the gender-based oppression that might lead to poor health. Think about the housewife that comes home, works for the whole family, and just appropriates one piece, one meal, and cook for 5 persons. That would be patriarchic exploitation. And we need to uncover the mechanisms and the dynamics that go from the power inequalities into economic exploitation and attitudes, without leaving any piece outside, without ignoring economics, without ignoring ideology, or without ignoring power relations. So that's it, briefly. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great, you can hear me. So thanks so much for having me, especially to Carlos. It's a real honor to be here. I joke that when I was in grad school wanting to study social class and health, every good idea that I had at that time, Carlos had already had 20 or 30 years before me. And that is what sparked our ongoing collaborations. So, my role here is to kind of reflect on the previous presentations and really try to think about this question of what kind of research is needed in the field of the social determinants of health. And so I'll be very brief, but there were really three main points that I took away from these presentations that I wanted to just try to synthesize and set out for hopefully a rich conversation later. But the first is that the social determinants of health research needs to really acknowledge that there is conflict in the world, and we need to take sides, and we need to ask ourselves, who are we conducting research for? And this, I think, gets to this issue of social relations and the who in the power relations that Megan was mentioning. And this means acknowledging that there are no tenants without landlords, there are no employees without bosses. And it is these social relations that are the sources of power imbalances. And it also means that we have to be explicit about capitalism, white supremacy, cis-hetero patriarchy, legacies of colonialism, not as sort of as abstract concepts, but as real struggles that are currently being fought. And I think one of the challenges to this is that our statistical methods are not really easily equipped to deal with the relational aspects of the social determinants of health. And so that's a major challenge, I think, for us moving forward. So the first point is that we need to be explicit about the who. We need to be explicit about conflict in the world, and we need to take sides as researchers and ask whether we're conducting research for people in positions of power, or we're conducting research for the social movements that are fighting for justice. And that leads to the kind of second major takeaway from these presentations, which is that we really need to be explicit about our theories of change. And I think this means asking whether our theories of change, whether our theory of change is technocratic. Does change happen through technocratic expertise? Is it top down? Does it happen from the policymaker to the public? Or does it happen through mass social movements that shift our understanding of what is possible, that create new demands, that end up forcing changes in policy? So is it bottom up? And I think being explicit about our theory of change, one example of this, adopting a theory of change that recognizes that change happens through mass social movements rather than through technocratic expertise, is in the US at least. Social movements have really shifted our understanding of what the policy goals ultimately are. So in the United States, we are fighting for a Green New Deal, and there are Green New Deals for housing, Green New Deals for transportation, Green New Deals for energy, and that shift in the goal has really changed the way that we evaluate all of the incremental policy approaches and policy changes that we're fighting for along the way. Another example is the struggle for abolition of police and prisons in the US, right? These having a bottom-up social movement-driven theory of change can help us actually shift our understanding of what is possible. And the third major takeaway for me was that really asking ourselves the question, sort of what problems still require research and what problems don't require more research. And so do we need more research on the role of income and education and health, or do we already know that poverty and income inequality are things that we need to eliminate? We know people need housing. We know people need living wages. We know people need access to free healthcare. These are basic prerequisites for health. And so then the question becomes, what sort of research can be useful for social movements fighting for the things that we already know that we need, rather than simply documenting what we already know to be the case. And so I think we have a sort of tendency in public health to make health the reason why we should be fighting for something. But I would argue that social determinants of health research should recognize that health may be a reason why we should be fighting for universal housing or universal jobs or living wages, but it's not necessarily the reason why we should be fighting for those things. Health is not the reason why we're fighting for police and prison abolition in the United States, but it can be a reason that may be useful for social movements, in particular strategic moments, to win arguments and compel change. So I'll actually just add quickly a fourth thought that occurred to me during these presentations, which is that I think the social determinants of health research needs to really be explicit about the fact that the nature and scale of our response to the climate crisis is going to be the single determining factor in shaping the health of communities and generations for generations to come. And I think one of the major lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic, at least in the United States, is that there is really no amount of preventable suffering and death that will be enough to compel policymakers to protect the most vulnerable. And I think this really gets back to some of the previous points about our theories of change and who we're conducting research for, and being explicit and taking sides about the conflicts that are going on in the world. But I think this didn't come up in some of the presentations, but I do think it's something that we need to be thinking about, is that the nature and scale of our response to the climate crisis is going to exacerbate all of the social determinants of health that we care about. So those are my four takeaways from these talks, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
I'm only interjecting just to say that obviously we're running a bit late, and I just want to warn everyone that we're going to be a bit late for lunch, but we do need to have a discussion, and that was a fascinating panel. Carlos, I don't know if you wanted to actually initiate with some comments yourself, but it would be great if the audience could also chip in, and if we could aim to finish for 1:15.
Okay, thanks so much, Seth. That's fantastic. I would like to open the mic to the public in case, well, I expect that there may be questions regarding the panel.
Okay. Good morning. I am Laura Aguirre. So I have a question. Yesterday, one of my classmates asked me, why do I believe, which he is just right here. Why do I believe information means action? Because he doesn't, and I agree with him. So I think my question is, how can, with the last presentation, how can public health improve the research to the action? Because I do believe the information plays a key role in the process, but we are not growing as fast, as big, and as powerful as the inequalities in the world. So how can really we improve this research?
Seth, do you want to
Oh,
answer?
Sure. I think that's a really great question, and I think my response is sort of biased to the U.S. context, where our professional incentives are to have access to people in positions of power, and we always talk about the policy relevance of our research. But we don't really talk about the relevance of our research to social movements or to unions or to other grassroots struggles. And so I think for me, one of the key ways that we can think about how we can translate information into action is to be responsive to the questions that social movements are asking, not necessarily as responsive to the questions that policymakers who are already in positions of power want the answers to. Very often, policymakers are interested in making very small incremental changes that don't upset the status quo. And so if we only answer the questions that policymakers are interested in, we're not going to be able to rise to the struggles that we're facing. And so I think being connected to, we should make it a priority to be connected to social movements and fights on the ground and be directly responsive to the questions that they are answering and directly responsive to the information that they would like. And I think that would be a great start.
Thank you, Seth. As someone who's been involved for a couple of decades with union research in the US, I found that very rewarding at the same very challenging, because their tempos don't necessarily align with ours as researcher. And even the needs don't concur. For example, I was very interested in the super exploitation of nurse assistants. Seth was involved in part of that. But what they appreciated, for example, is that I showed that the nurse assistants had high levels of education, which they used to ask for higher wages. So the example is that our goals may not be aligned, but that's okay. I mean, I accepted that wasn't about me, basically. First, it was about them. And of course, that can have a price to pay if you want academically. But I think in my case, it was worthwhile to work with SCIU. That's all I can say. Thank you. Any other comment about this question or another question?
Yeah, another. I am Alexis Benos from Greece. Thanks for wrapping up in this session and continuing the discussion from the first session. And thanks that we are finally hearing the causes of the causes of the cause, which is called capitalism. Okay, we have forgotten that. I mean, if you see all the literature of our literature, I'm not speaking from others. Well, I don't know why we are afraid of using the word, you know.
No, I am not.
You are not, of course. Anyway, so yeah, I think that this is the way that we have to speak up, because this is also going to give to the movement, as we were discussing now, to the movement some aim. I mean, that it is the system. It's not only a politician or another politician or a union or a not union. It is a system that we have to overthrow if we want to protect health. One. The second, which is, I'm opening just, I think it's a big discussion, but anyway, epistemological discussion, is that if we are speaking about the capitalism, as a system. Then we have to discuss systematically or holistically what is happening. The term, and I think we have seen that with Sir Marmot before, the term of social determinants of health, it is opening, and we have seen that, the possibility to fragment every determinant as a classic old epidemiology factor, risk factor, and say, this is a social determinant, the other is a social determinant, but nothing is holistic. So, and this is a question mark also for the new name of the journal. I mean, wouldn't it be better to say social determinants of health instead of determinants? You see the point. Thanks.
I didn't fully understand. Social determinants?
Spelled with an A-N-C-E at the end.
Like as a, I think it's called a gerund.
Oh, I see.
The act of something being socially determined.
Well, I don't know. In Latin America, they prefer social determination. I don't have a preference. To me, it's not a big, doesn't make a big difference. The context is a system where you have political, economic, and cultural subsystems that interact, and you need to establish the relationships, the mechanisms that sustain these relationships to be able to have ideas about how to change them, and of course see their effect on health, which is another subsystem, the biological in a society. So we adopt a systemic approach, and all these terminologies don't make a big difference once we adopt that framework. With regards to capitalism, absolutely. But as you can see, if you analyze capitalism, there, as I mentioned, there are deviations now into neo-feudalism in some areas. We don't know with monopoly capitalism and then this platform work, where is it going to lead? But there is some variety of economic systems around there. There is also the super exploitation of the South, where there is a combination of capitalism that's wages are so low that they don't cover the reproduction of labor power, and then individuals have to resort to non-capitalist forms of production to compensate. And you could say that also in the US, partially with Medicare and Medicaid and companies like Walmart. They pay under the reproduction of the labor power, so individuals have to qualify to Medicaid in order to be able to survive. So it's always a mixture of different modes of production, I think, these days. And that's what class is about. Capitalism is about class. It generates classes and reproduces them. That's something that people forget usually, because class is seen as a personal attribute. Anybody wants to talk about this? Sorry, Juan, please.
Yes, a short comment, following up this point. Yeah, we don't have to be afraid, of course, of saying capitalism. The problem is that what does it mean? What is behind? What are the processes? What are the mechanisms? We have to go there in order to understand all these impacts that affect the population. So we can use capitalism or we cannot use. We can use it rhetorically or not rhetorically. The same thing with the social determinants of health. What matters is what is behind. Social determinants of health can be used as risk factors. Actually, it has been used in that way. Social determinants of health, risk factor, okay. So it's a battle there to provide meaning to what we mean by social determinants of health. And since this has become mainstream in a sense, although I agree, social determination is perfectly fine to me, we have to give content there, right? And that's the battle, to give history, political economy, all the issues that we are talking about, social relations, mechanisms, all these kind of things to explain and that help to implement policies. And by the way, following up the point you made between this gap between researchers and, for example, union people, here certainly we have a problem. Times are different. So that's why sometimes I think that we also, beside high level sophisticated analysis that we have to do, we must do, we also need to complement that with what all epidemiologists said, quick and dirty analysis, right? Quick and dirty, but deep analysis that are useful for the unions or for the social movement, because they need sometimes data in weeks or months. And typically researchers, we need much more time. Maybe we need 2 years as a longitudinal study or things like that. So we need to combine both things.
Well, I would like to put a question that has not come up, which has to do with what Bourdieu called that you should state from what point of view you are looking at the problem. Because if you don't do that, then you have like science is neutral, and if I find something, that's okay. If I don't, and I would argue that you should do that, take that position from the beginning, and then out from that point of view, you are saying, I am going to look for the things that are affecting those people that I take their point of view of in research, which actually bring you to a position where you don't need to be an activist to do research on what is the impact of capitalism in its variant, where you are making the research to, you don't need to be an activist. You can be a researcher, but you should make it explicit what are my point of view, because science is, social science particularly has to do with what is my point of, to whom am I, am I trying to make research on? And that takes away part of the discussion about if it's neutral, if it's has a preference for some kind of in power relations, for example, that's very clear about what are we doing. Thank you. It's just, I think that we should think more about methodology than we are doing. Thank you.
Well, if I may, public health and epidemiology, at least as an applied science, public health as a technology, they are values implicitly because they act on the world, like engineering, law. They cannot be neutral or pretend so, because part of their duty is to have values, to signal a course of action rather than other, and that requires having values. And with regard to science, you can be partial and at the same time being objective. I mean, I can do a clinical trial thinking that this population gets health in all policies and this other doesn't. And I really want to have health in all policies. And then at the same time, trying to be objective, because if I'm not, it's not going to be replicated and it's going to be worse. So I don't see a problem. Maybe it's being able to, quote unquote, being a good scientist, to not let your preferences, your partiality to affect your objectivity, but that's about it. Science is self-corrected. It's the best way of knowing.
Can I add something? I think you're both right. I just had this conversation actually with somebody who was, she's a director of this really neat organization we have fairly new in the US. It's the Interdisciplinary Association for Population Health Sciences, and she's putting together a blog series on essentially on kind of values in science. And she was doing these interviews, and one of the questions was about this issue of objectivity. You know, does your ideology influence your science? And I said, of course it does, and of course it doesn't, because I think that your choice of question is always influenced by your priors, right? By your dispositions. And I think it probably is a good thing to be very transparent about that I'm asking these questions because this matters to me, right? But I think that it's a little bit dangerous to assume that the conclusions that we draw are influenced by our positions, because if that's the case, then we've entered very, you know, relative territory, and it starts to get a little bit murky. What science can we trust? What science can't we, right? Is there sort of different knowledge bases for different people? So I think, you know, my personal take of it is that there's room for both. There's room for this old-fashioned notion of objectivity, but there's also, there are also really important ways in which our predispositions influence what we choose to spend our time on.
So I just have another, my name is Nihaya Dawood. I'm a researcher in public health and academic. And I think, you know, I'm doing research on Palestinians' health for many years in Israel. And one of the things that our research was affected by is our position in the as a Palestinians, a Palestinian minority in Israel, and how I mean we sometimes could not have even access to data because of the regime. So many times it's not that we have unlimited power to affect and the research and bring our voices and say capitalism or patriarchy or you know, sexism. Sometimes also it's the power that is affecting us, and I think this is something that has to be considered when actually we are conducting this kind of research. Thank you.
Thank you, Nihaya.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the big subject we haven't addressed is the lack of autonomy that researchers have in pursuing research questions, because so much is dependent on research grants and research funding, and also even the journals, and then the people on the committees. And really, the idea that research is, that we have freedom to explore and raise the important research questions is increasingly being curtailed because of the nature of the way in which our institutions are funded and the performance targets that they place on researchers. And I think this is really important.
It's true.
Yeah, and what research is funded, what questions are funded, is all framed before we get to the important questions.
But, it's still one of the jobs where you can be more autonomous. And if you're creative, you can go around it. The system in the US, for example, NIH, once you get the money, I mean, you can pretty much do what you want. So it's true, but it's not so bleak as you paint it, at least in North America. Maybe not in the UK.
So this conversation definitely needs to continue over lunch, but there is one last question from the back, and then I'm going to call this session to a close.
Okay. Thanks for your interventions. I have a question thought inspired by your intervention, Megan, and it's related to when you're talking about the commodification as a dimension of this translation of power relations into health meanings. And something you said is that our tools right now are very good, but then the access to them sometimes is relative. My question is regarding the tools. I think there are tools that are great, but also tools are not neutral. And well, the previous panel was talking about drugs and how all that is not neutral. And right now we can also see that, for example, artificial intelligence is not a neutral tool. It can help productivist dynamics further and then capitalist process as well. So my question is regarding this, how do you see the relationships between power relations, materialities, and then health meanings?
See the second term there, power relations.
Materiality,
materiality.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
I mean, I think in terms of commodification, I think that one of the things that we see is that people who have the power have access to the earliest incarnations of health promoting resources. The interesting thing here, I think, from a research perspective is, what does that mean when those early versions of things carry hidden costs? So there are lots of interventions that are made available to people that are not yet well tested and may actually be a lot riskier than advertised. And I think that there's an opportunity there in some sense to see how the quick adoption of some of these technologies can increase health inequalities by improving the health of people who have the resources to access them, but may also actually in some weird way mitigate inequalities when those resources are not as straightforwardly beneficial for health as we think. So, you know, for example, many of the, coming back to the issue of the predominance of the pharmaceutical industry, you know, many of the most sought after drugs that are in the US anyway, pretty much automatically patented for a period of time and prohibited from generic production, are accessed only by people with the most resources. And some of those drugs, you know, once they have been on the market for quite a while, we find have all of these unknown, but often poorly documented. So known, but poorly documented side effects that put those higher income populations at risk. And so there's a way to, I think in some sense, kind of track how the diffusion of these technologies can affect health, because there are very targeted groups that have access to them. And in some sense, it simplifies some of the methodological issues we face, where it becomes very difficult to pinpoint who's been exposed to something. So it's almost a bit of a litmus test in some ways for how commodification and the availability, not just of pharmaceuticals, but all kinds of potential health, let's just say changing, right? Health changing resources affect populations differently, and what that process looks like and how it unfolds over time, and how it may compound or interact with other factors. So, I mean, I don't know that I have a clear answer to what is it that commodification, what are the exact mechanisms that link commodification to material conditions and then to health? But I think that following the dissemination of some of these kinds of technologies under highly commodified contexts would actually provide an incredibly illuminating explanation for what that process looks like. And I hope that at least partially answered your question. If not, we can talk more over lunch.
Which nicely brings me
Thank you. Thank you
this.
so much.
Yeah, so thank you to all of our panelists on this session. So to Carlos, to Megan, to Jersey, and to Seth, who's joined us online. Can you just please give them a round of applause? To me, what was really striking is that this morning's session has brought up the same issues. So the importance of the political and the ethical, the idea of agenda setting and the methodologies that we're using. And this is why this journal is so important, because it does have some power, not all of the power, but some power to change the culture that we're fighting against. Now, when we come back after lunch, we're going to be looking at how the culture of neoliberalism is affecting healthcare systems in more detail.